The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Indigenous rights is far-reaching and complex. Indigenous peoples around the world are disproportionately affected by the virus, and the effects of the pandemic are exacerbating existing inequities and challenges for Indigenous communities. The pandemic has caused heightened levels of poverty, food insecurity, mental health issues, and access to healthcare. Many Indigenous communities lack access to essential healthcare services, and Indigenous peoples are particularly vulnerable to the virus due to underlying health conditions. In many cases, their access to healthcare is further compromised by language barriers, limited access to technology, and the remoteness of their communities. The pandemic has also caused economic disruption, particularly for Indigenous communities who rely on traditional hunting, fishing, gathering, and tourism activities as sources of income. These activities have been severely impacted by the pandemic, creating further economic instability for Indigenous communities. In addition to the direct impacts of the pandemic, Indigenous rights have been further undermined by the response of governments. In many cases, Indigenous rights and land have been ignored in the rapid implementation of emergency measures. For example, in Canada, the government has pushed forward with controversial pipeline projects while simultaneously introducing new regulations which limit Indigenous rights and access to land. The pandemic has also had a significant impact on Indigenous culture and languages. With the closure of schools, Indigenous languages are at risk of disappearing as there is limited opportunity to pass them on to new generations. Similarly, traditional cultural practices have been disrupted, including ceremonies, gatherings, and the sharing of knowledge. The long-term impacts of the pandemic on Indigenous rights are uncertain, but it is clear that the pandemic is further exacerbating existing inequities and challenges for Indigenous communities. It is essential that governments recognize the unique challenges facing Indigenous peoples and ensure that their rights and access to services are protected. This will require a comprehensive, long-term approach to addressing the economic, health, and cultural impacts of the pandemic.